Most people can't resist being sweet towards animals. They're generally sweet and don't have an evil bone in their body. They're the epitome of innocence. This story is sure to have you gripping your seats. This story is a roller coaster. It's happy, sad, full of suspense, and has a satisfying ending. You're probably curious as to how a true story can have all of those qualities. Well, sit back and enjoy the ride. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Jim Passmore woke up that day thinking it would be like any other. He didn't think his routine would be broken as the morning started just like it always did, with the sun coming over the horizon. Passmore lived in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and enjoyed nothing more than a good walk in the morning. The air was crisp as he marched along with his dogs as they made their way through the forest. But something would be waiting for Jim that he had never expected to find. Jim was passionate about nature, and thankfully, Broken Arrow had tons of it to go around. He loved his town surrounded by beautiful hills, shimmering lakes, and some majestic views. There aren't a lot of things that Jim could say he preferred over nature. An exception might have been his canine companions. His love for dogs exceeds anything else in his life. Jim took his 2 canines and would follow the same routine every day. He'd follow the same path into the forest to enjoy the beautiful scenes around him. But today he noticed something in the creek that had never been there before. He approached it but wasn't sure what it was. It appeared to be the log from a tree that was floating in the water of the creek, but as he got closer he saw other details, like that it was hairy. It was an animal, and it was stuck in the mud. Jim got closer and closer until he could see movement. It was clearly having a hard time getting out of the creek. It was trying it with all its energy to get out, but it wasn't strong enough. Jim would normally spend half an hour walking in the forest each day, but he knew as soon as he saw the animal that today he'd spend much more time by the creek than he normally did. Jim started getting really close to the brown thing now, but his dogs weren't so keen. They pulled away and started acting very strange. He needed to know what it was. His gut told him to keep moving closer to the thing in the water. He then saw a cage next to it. But what kind of animal was this then? It didn't help Jim figure out what it was. He suspected it was a beaver. It was the most likely thing, wasn't it? Beavers like to inhabit creeks and will float in the water. Maybe he shouldn't interfere with its business, but with the nearby cage, things didn't add up. The cage was similar to the ones you'd see animals being transported in. He took a peek inside the cage in case it gave him an idea of what the animal was. Why was it in a creek, though? It's possible the beaver found this cage and used it as a refuge. Maybe it was a groundhog hiding from the rain? Jim really couldn't tell. As he kept trying to think of what the animal could be, he saw something that made shivers shoot down his spine. Jim felt something incredibly off as he noticed a few new things about the cage. Feces were scattered all around it, along with an old worn blanket and a heavy chain. This was deliberate, he thought. The animal had been locked in the cage and chained to it. Jim then noticed that there were bite marks all over the cage. The animal had managed to escape just for it to get stuck in the mud. Just then, a beaver jumped from the woods and gave Jim a fright. He decided to tail the beaver to the riverbed where it sat. What was the beaver doing? This must have been odd behavior, even for a beaver. He was compelled to follow the beaver for some reason. He felt an urge deep inside of him. The beaver had stopped right next to the struggling animal, the same animal that Jim was so curious about. The ground under his feet was very damp. As Jim crept forward, he noticed something about the animal that he hadn't seen before. It was way bigger than he first thought, much too big to be a beaver. Jim couldn't stand by anymore. His body jumped into action before he could think about it. He had to save this animal no matter what it was. He could worry about its species later. Whatever it was, Jim was certain that he was going to get it out. He couldn't bear to leave a struggling animal fighting for its life. Jim figured that if this was, in fact, a beaver, it would be incredibly territorial. While his gut feeling told him that it probably wasn't a giant beaver, he still needed to be aware of those teeth just in case it decided to get free and chomp him like a salad. Beavers usually bite humans when they have rabies too, so this whole situation could go from hero to zero very quick. Jim called over a few people to help him, and one of them ended up getting bit. They rushed him to the hospital, but the rest of the team ended up staying put to try to get this animal out of the mud. Jim had to come up with a plan to avoid getting attacked again. Jim realized that he had to cover the animal's head. He had no idea how long it had been in the creek for, and it was surely alarmed by the number of people trying to get it out. It quickly calmed down after the jersey was placed over its head. I mean, not gonna lie, I would be freaking out even more if my vision was suddenly gone, but good for the animal. Jim needed a plan that could hoist the animal out of the water. They tried to dig around it, but since the animal was half submerged in the mud, it was incredibly difficult. They needed a pulley system or some sort of crane. Unfortunately, there wasn't going to be a crane anytime soon, so they would have to go with the pulley. They quickly realized there was a flaw, though. The mystery animal was refusing to budge. It seemed like it was truly stuck and had no plans of wanting to be free. But they kept trying, and eventually they started to feel it getting looser. This gave them a new sense of will to try even harder. They gave it one final yank, and the beaver was lifted to safety. But as Jim wiped the animal's face, he stumbled backward. This was no giant beaver. This was no giant groundhog. This was a dog. Beneath the mud was a quivering yet beautiful sheepdog. They weren't messing with a territorial beaver. They were dealing with a scared dog. It looked like the dog had been there for quite some time, but was in relatively good shape considering all of the stuff that seemed to happen to it. So, how did it get there? Jim called the police, and they were quick to the scene. What was so bizarre to Jim about this whole situation was that he was led to the dog by the actual beaver he met near the cage. Was this dog being taken care of by the beaver? I mean, obviously there isn't much a beaver can do for a dog, but it's cool to have a fantasy that they were buddies. The more time the guys spent with the dog, the more they realized that it was in really poor condition. The dog was responsive, at least a little bit. The main priority was to keep the dog warm and comfortable. They would come to know the dog as Teddy, and by putting a blanket over it, they felt like Teddy was only going to get better in terms of his immediate health. They knew that they had to get him to some professional treatment fast, but Teddy was in no shape to be able to just wander or walk by himself. They decided to use the resources that they had around them and grabbed a wheelbarrow. They weren't about to go and rushed back to their car. Teddy was obviously tired from the exhausting experience of constantly trying to get air while being stuck in the mud. Jim dialed up the Oklahoma Alliance for Animals, OAA, and the team worked quickly to get Teddy into their care. The team was warned that they would have their work cut out for them. Teddy was still unreceptive to humans, and while the way that he ended up in the creek is unknown, there are credible theories. One theory was that he got hit by a car, was injured, and his owner left him to die. Another was that his owner didn't want him any longer, so he brought him out in a cage and tried to drown him. Jim couldn't stop thinking about the single blanket and weight that he found in the dog's cage. They landed on the name Teddy because of his cuddly appearance. They would have to work on Teddy actually trusting humans again in order for him to act cuddly, but it was a work in progress. Teddy was a dog with multiple lives. He got lucky. The situation that he was put in was horrible. He had to fight for his life for a long period of time. But the chances of someone actually finding him and taking the time to save him was incredible. Also, he was very lucky that the Oklahoma Alliance for Animals took him in. They were able to find a place for him to stay instead of a shelter. If a shelter had received the call for help, they probably would have euthanized him. Teddy ended up receiving the vet care that he needed. He was finally in stable condition. In a panic, Teddy had bitten one of the people trying to save him. There was some concern that he might have rabies. After some thorough testing, it was determined that Teddy didn't have any rabies, which was a relief. It took a couple of days for Teddy to fully get used to his pen at the OAA. Eventually, he warmed up to the workers. They administered pain medication that also helped him come back to a state of ease. After some more testing, they realized that he was probably in a lot of pain, which is why the medication was necessary. But there was still a major problem that needed to be fixed. Teddy's vet chalked up his inability to gracefully move around as a reason to why he was unhealthy. He wasn't very active for a dog and became severely overweight, which only added to the problems he was already facing. As Teddy's story started to get slightly viral, his health started improving. He went from being a sluggish pup that was unfriendly and wanted to be left alone to being playful and affectionate. He really found a caring person in the receptionist at the OAA. Her name was Jessie. It was almost as if Teddy was excited he was finally getting famous. Well, doggy famous anyway, and probably not famous for the right reasons. The OAA actively campaigns to reduce the number of animals euthanized every year. They also give cheap spaying and neutering procedures to the public. In the United States, about 6 million animals are processed into the shelter system every single year. Of those, about 3 million are dogs. The sheer volume of strays presents a problem for many shelter spaces. Mix the lack of space and the low adoption rates, and you have a problem that really only has one solution. Shelters end up euthanizing about 700,000 dogs every single year, which is incredibly sad.